two reasons the Jets need to go after Deshaun Watson, free agent from the Texans. Number one, we have not had a stable quarterback since Rex Ryan and Mark Sanchez, so that's like 11 years ago. Since then, we've been in the carousel of quarterbacks, and it's not often at all that a top 5 quarterback wants out of his franchise home. He wants out of the Texans, and he wants to come to the Jets, Daniel. I'm telling you, we got to make this move. We have the cap space. We have the draft picks. Why wouldn't we pull the trigger?
Yeah, good point. Well, welcome to the Spirit Talk podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is my friend Andy Romano. How do you say your last name?
Just Romano.
Oh,
no
okay.
need to roll the tongue. You're good.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to be talking about the judgment seat of Christ. And this is something actually that I don't really know about, so I'm going to be mostly asking a ton of questions. And because I know that Andy has been interested in this aspect in Scripture. And we're just going to look into it and read about it and look through Scripture and other books and resources we can, however we can learn about it more, and however you have learned about it in the past. We can just talk about those things. So I guess
for sure, sounds fun.
What? How did you come across this first?
Yeah, no. So I'm not much of an expert on the subject by any means, but when I first got exposed to this subject, it was basically I knew nothing about it, and I was just watching a bunch of IHOP, International House of Prayer, videos and sermons, and one of them was about the judgment seat of Christ. And I remember seeing that. I'm like, judgment seat of Christ? I don't really even know what this is. So I listened to the sermon, and I was absolutely floored. It was all basically new material, and I was blown away. And I remember after listening to that sermon, I was like, why is this subject, which I was realizing is so important, why doesn't it get much attention? Like, why have I, basically my question was, why have I never heard this before? I felt betrayed. Why hasn't anyone told me about this? And from there, it just launched me into a study, basically becoming a student of this subject. Through books, scripture, sermons, and whatever I could get my hands on to understand it more.
If you feel like that, why hasn't anybody told you about this before? Like, how heavy is this talked about in Scripture, actually, do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's actually a handful of passages that dissect it in fair amount of detail. I wouldn't say it's all over, it's not as heavily talked about as like other parts of the gospel, but there's enough material there that when I was just thinking about, okay, what scriptures, talk about with Daniel, there was like 8 or 9 that just immediately came to me, and so there's definitely material there on the subject. Jesus talked about it a fair amount of times, but I just feel like, as it did in me a lot, hearing the word judgment, I think invokes fear, makes you a little uncomfortable, and trying to understand, how does Jesus, who saved us by grace, judge us? I thought that was no judgment, no punishment, fear. Love casts out all fear. Fear has to do with punishment. I thought that was all done. And so I guess I kind of had a wall to that idea until I understood it from a biblical perspective, and I was like, oh, wow, I was looking at this all wrong.
What are some scriptures that you brought to the table today that you think that would really speak to that?
Yeah, I'll just start right away with probably the one that I think a lot of people are familiar with this passage, 1 Corinthians 3. And this is probably the one that is the most clear, kind of sets it forward pretty straightforward here. So in 1 Corinthians 3, Paul is talking about his ministry with the Corinthians, talking about him and Apollos, one watered, one planted, but God brought the growth, right? So he's talking about the different laborers and their piece in sharing the gospel with people. And then he kind of jumps down in verse 12 here, and he's talking about, now how does the individual build their life on the gospel they received, on the gospel that they heard? And Paul says there are a couple ways to do it. I'll just read it in verse 12. He says, "If anyone builds on this foundation of Jesus using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or stubble, their work will be shown for what it is. Because the day," meaning the day of judgment, "will bring it to light." So the concept is every believer is going about their life, and they have this foundation. Salvation is this foundation, and Paul paints them the picture of they're a builder. Now they're building on this foundation. Jesus saved them. Now what are they doing?
Mm-hmm.
In every deed, every decision, every pursuit, you're building this structure, right?
Yeah.
And then Paul continues this imagery, and he says, it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it's burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but will be saved. So Paul's just making it super clear. Hey, it's nothing to do with salvation.
Mm-hmm.
If you've accepted Jesus by grace, you will stand before him received and forgiven. But there's accountability. There's like this sense of evaluation as we look at, okay, you got saved. Now what did you do for the kingdom from there on out? Did you live for yourself? Did you seek first Andy's interests, or did I seek first the kingdom's interests and what was good for Jesus? And so there's this 1 Corinthians 3 here paints this picture of evaluating the life choices of a believer is really what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm. What about suffering loss? What do you think that means?
Yeah, that's actually
We'll suffer loss.
Yeah, that's a great question there. So again, looking at this as Paul was super clear in verse 15, it doesn't have to do with salvation. It's
Mm-hmm.
not suffering in a punitive sense, like you're being punished, like there's physical suffering involved. But what they're suffering loss, meaning they're looking at their life that they built on this foundation. They see their building, and it turns out a lot of it was selfish ambition, and they were pursuing their own interests, and the things they did, a lot of it had to do with, how other people saw them, even the good things they did. And all these negative heart postures ended up being what consumed their life. Now, this is worst case scenario. I don't know how many believers will actually be what I just described there, but the point is those are the things that will be exposed. Now, they're going to be burned up. They're not going to be used to punish you. They're not going to be used be held against you. They're going to be gone. They're going to be forgiven. They're going to be removed. So the idea of suffering loss is if I'm looking at my life, right, and I see, say, half of it was burned up, the loss I would be suffering is, man, what would have happened if that was gold I built with instead of wood? What if I sought the kingdom in that circumstance, in that relationship, in that decision, instead of seeking myself? What fruit could I have brought to Jesus? And that's the loss that's going to be suffered. Because as you see here, Jesus' point in the evaluation isn't, oh man, I'm looking forward to that day where I can tell Andy finally all the ways he messed up.
Mm-hmm.
He said that it'll be, the fire will test the quality of the work, not to confront, not to rebuke, but to reward. That's the point of that day for Jesus, is he's looking forward to rewarding us for all the things that we did for his kingdom. It's actually kind of, it's just another expression of his grace that we're all fallen humans. I mean, more often I suck than I do well. And yet Jesus wants me to stand before him, and he's going to reward me for my good intentions, for the things I did do for him, and for the times I resisted sin. And it's going to be like, man, Jesus, why? No, I'm not asking for that. Like, you did so much for me. Why is the concept of reward even there? And it's an expression of his generous heart, how appreciative he is for his people who served him.
Do you think it would be accurate, like, when he says suffer loss, do you think that's suffering a loss of what we could have, like all the rewards and the good that we can have, but because of our motives or because of our heart's intentions with everything in life, that, do you think that's what it is?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's a loss of what could have been.
What about any other verses? Do you have anything else?
Yeah, and just going off that, it makes me think of the parable of the sower.
Yeah.
Where Jesus said different types of soils, and here are the different reasons people reject bearing fruit. And when he gets down to the last reason, well, first one's like Satan comes and takes it away, persecution and trials, and then the thorns that choke.
Mm-hmm.
The thorns that choke are like the worries of life, deceitfulness of riches, and then desire for other things. And so personally, I think that is going to be the issue, right? Is, okay, what parts of my life did I choose my desire for things outside of his will, or an overindulgence in good things that I should have had more moderation in, right? But an overindulgence in good things, and I chased all these other desires at the expense of bearing fruit. Because God gives us good things to enjoy, but if it becomes at the expense of bearing fruit, I think that's what's going to be evaluated, because Paul continues on into 1 Corinthians 4, and he talks about stewardship. You know, like, we've been entrusted with something. We've been entrusted with gifts and talents, and a lot of that is like relational gifts, how we connect with people, how we can serve people. And the point was that we would share the love of Jesus, and we would forward the gospel in our everyday interactions. And it's not in the big giant stuff. Very few believers do the big giant stuff, right? Very few fill the stadiums and all that stuff, because not everyone is called to that. It's the everyday relationship things that we do as believers that Jesus is entrusting to us, and he's going to reward.
We talk about like comparison, comparing ourselves with other people, like you said, those people that are doing like really grand things, like missionaries that are, you know,
Right.
Mother Teresa, or just anybody you look out throughout look at throughout history, like how we can compare ourselves, and we want to be great in the kingdom for God, and we want to be doing grand things. Like, maybe, like, it's not even necessarily like a selfish interest, but it's I just got into the mode in my mind where I was like really talking to my audience. That was weird. That was a weird moment. Like I wasn't even talking to you anymore or something. Yeah, but we get into this thing where like, yeah, I want to be great. I want to be doing a bunch of stuff for God. I want to be doing grand things for God, and we feel like we're not doing enough because we're not doing certain things that we think are great. And yeah, just like what about that? I was thinking about this morning about competition, how we compete with other Christians, and how we compare with other Christians. And I find myself so many times comparing myself with other Christians and thinking that, like, I get back to this, like I fall back down and I'm like, what am I really doing for the kingdom if like I'm not doing this certain thing or this certain thing? And yeah,
I think everybody can relate to that.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, man. The struggles I've had with that are, in the past, have been literally off the charts, where I would feel like, okay, what I'm doing is worthless because I'm influencing like one or two people, and I'm, you know, hearing stories about people who would go and Reinhard Bonnke preach to like everybody in Africa. And I'm like,
dude, what is
what
that
am I
cause?
doing, man?
Yeah, what does that cause in our hearts? I think that causes like it causes us to then think we have to work for something rather than doing something out of love and with the right motive, like with the right heart about it. Because, man, I'm not doing much. I got to do so much more. I got to do so much more to be like accepted of God. Like it's that He's given you what you have is not by mistake. Like He's given you what you have. Do as much as you can that He's wanting you to do with those things. That do as much as you can with what He's wanting you to do with those things, rather than thinking you have to do so much more than what you already have, or what situation God's placed you in, or like, man, dude, like so many times I think I've been married for only a year and a half, like a year and a half now, and I sometimes think that my family life is not as significant as something else like I could be doing, but the family life is so, like, because it's just it's seemingly mundane things each day in and day out. Like it seems like, so I'm not doing all these great things. I'm not doing but yeah, man, I think about the parable of the talents when I think about that stuff, where, the one guy, he had the 10 talents, right? 5 talents or whatever.
Sure,
it was
sure.
doubled because he used it. He was, God blessed what he gave to him because he was going out and using those talents. And the other guy got 2 or whatever, and that was doubled. And then the other guy, the last guy, he got 1, and he buried it in the ground, right? He wanted to keep it. He wanted to hold on to it without using it, just to make sure he kept on, make sure he held on to what was given to him, but he didn't actually use it. So he was trying to, I think he was trying to hold on to his life rather than lose it.
Yeah.
For the gospel.
Right.
And because I really think that is related to that verse, like when Jesus says, "Lose your life for my sake, and you will find it." So.
Right. Yeah. I think what you're talking about in comparison is honestly super relevant. And you had a really good point where you said that comparison and competition, the worst fruit of all, it messes with our motives. Because no longer am I doing something just purely out of love. It becomes those tainted things like, oh, I'm supposed to do this. I need to do more of this. And then it's the person you're serving is honestly getting cheated out of a true and genuine encounter with Jesus, because you're no longer doing it for Jesus. You're doing it for your own sake because you feel like you need to do more. And something I heard that was super relieving to me in this sort of conversation is I was told that you will never be evaluated for the gifts you don't have. You will never be evaluated for the opportunities you don't have, just what has been given to you. So I won't be compared to Billy Graham. I won't be compared to missionary so-and-so because I wasn't in their shoes.
Yeah.
The point of the parable that you were just talking about, the talents in Matthew 25, is that each one was given something different, a different amount, but the master's response was the same for both servants. One had 10, one had 5, right? They were both faithful. The master responded the same way. He said that you were faithful, well done, enter into the joy of your master. And it's not like the one who had 10 got extra. It was the same because they were both faithful. And so I think of it in terms of us, where Jesus has entrusted certain gifts, certain influence that he's given to us, certain relationships, and he's given us those few and small things, like the parable says, that you've been entrusted with few and small things and you were faithful, well done. And I think sometimes we look for the big and many, where Jesus has given us the small and the few, or the small and the few. And I think when we're looking for big things, we miss all the little things. We miss listening to people. We miss sharing our story with someone, and we're like, oh man, like sharing my story with one person, so-and-so shared their story with 1,000 people when they preached it. Don't go there. Like, Jesus isn't gonna ask that question, how many thousands did you share your story with? He's gonna ask Daniel, did you love well? I gave you X, Y, and Z opportunities. Did you take them? It's like, yeah, Jesus, but it only reached like 15 people. Hey, like I'm not worried about that. Those were the 15 people I wanted you to reach. The enemy, man, he will lie all day and say it's not worth much. It's a small impact. But again, in the parable of the talents, he said, you were faithful with small and few. Your impact was small and your opportunities were few, only a couple people, but that servant was celebrated. In today's culture, we don't celebrate the small.
Yeah.
We celebrate the big. We put those people on documentaries. We write books about those, and rightly so, but it makes the everyday person feel like they're failing.
Yeah. The significance of the seemingly small, I think not quotes for that. It's seemingly small. I think needs to be, jacked up to it is big. Like, you're right. Like, the culture is really for the people who, like, I wouldn't say never, but you wouldn't really naturally normally see a documentary on someone who's really faithful with the small that they have. And dude,
Sure.
okay, well, I didn't put a timer on it, but we got to do a second part, I think, because that went by fast. All right, so you're going to see a part 2. This is the end of the first part. Thanks for watching and listening.